The CPU and motherboard that you choose for your next gaming PC build are two of the most important parts to get right. But with so many great options out there from AMD and Intel, with an endless list of motherboard chipsets, designs and manufacturers, the whole thing can be really confusing. Which is why today I'll be breaking down the best CPU and motherboard combos to select for a wide range of budgets. Everything from the budget 1080p gamer to those with money to burn for high-end top-of-the-range 4K gaming. Let's do this. The Corsair Xeneon Flex provides the ultimate large form factor OLED gaming experience. With a massive 21:9 45-inch panel that bends from being fully flat to up to 800R, there is nothing else like it. The 3440x1440p resolution is sharp, while the 240Hz refresh rate makes this a great option for competitive gamers. Learn more about the Corsair Xeneon Flex at the Corsair web store, linked down in the description below. You can use the timestamps and navigation bar below to skip through all of the different recommendations in this video, and everything I mention will be linked at the description down below. The first important bit of context, the question I suppose that's on everyone's mind, which is better, AMD or Intel? Honestly, neither. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages, but they're pretty level pegging. And you'll find that most of the time it just comes down to price, depending on which CPU is better for what budget. And that's why our recommendations today will flip-flop between AMD, Intel, back to AMD, back to Intel. You get the gist. It's also important to talk about naming schemes, how on earth CPU naming schemes actually work. On the Intel side, you have the i3, i5, i7, and i9. The higher the number, the more powerful the CPU. While on the AMD side, you have the Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7, and Ryzen 9. They're pretty comparable. A Ryzen 5 and an Intel Core i5 are pretty evenly matched, which make things actually nice and simple. It is worth noting that AMD haven't released a Ryzen 7000 version of their Ryzen 3 lineup, aka all of AMD's Ryzen 3 chips are old and a bit out of date, which means Intel will win out for some of the budget recommendations. And it's also worth noting that these manufacturers update their CPUs with new generations every year or so. For Intel, we're on the 13th gen of chips, while AMD were on the Ryzen 7000 lineup. Now, if you've got a really tight budget to spend, you want to game and game only, no video editing, no streaming, nothing like that at 1080p, I would suggest you pick up something like the Intel Core i3 12 or 13100F. There isn't a great deal of difference between the 12 and 13100F, and they both pair really well with a B-series motherboard, something a little bit like this. If you go for the 12100F, I'd recommend you opt for a B660 motherboard, while for a 13100F, you want a B760 board. Look out for boards with the letter designation AX or Wi-Fi. That indicates it has wireless networking. Very important if you're building your first system and haven't got wired connectivity. But don't worry too much other than that about feature set. You want the cheapest B-series Wi-Fi board possible. On the Intel side of the equation, budget motherboards start with the letter B, while the high-end overclocking boards start with the letter Z. While on the AMD side, you've got the X670 chipset being the highest end, B650 sitting in the middle, and the new A620 lineup down at the bottom. Both B and X series for AMD do support overclocking, which is one key difference versus the Intel lineup. The i3 is a great choice, 4 cores, 8 threads. It is very simple, but it does what you need it to do. And for playing even the latest AAA titles at 1080p with a solid GPU, you're going to be in luck. Just don't expect much by way of leverage for basically anything else. If you want to step up though and see slightly more advanced 1080p gaming numbers, maybe even dabble one day to 1440p gaming, you have actually got options on both sides of the equation. For AMD, I'd recommend picking up their Ryzen 5 7600 or Ryzen 5 7600X. The former non-X chip is slightly slower in terms of clock speed, but has the same cores, same number of threads, and will cost you less money. Ryzen 7000 historically wasn't great for budget gamers, but with the release of these new A620 chipset motherboards, things really are changing. I picked up this ASRock board for a shave over $100 from Newegg, I'll link it down below, but one thing that's actually really quite special about it is it basically gives you all the features of B650 minus the overclocking support while costing you next to nothing. You also get great next-gen connectivity, so for example on this board here you'll see not only the Wi-Fi but our USB Type-C and USB Type-A for those 3.2 Gen 2 ports. And if you look on the side of the board just here, you'll also notice the inclusion of front panel USB-C and front panel USB 3. Obviously you can can see, the board is a bit more bare bones. There's far less traces on the back of the board. That's a good way to see how expensive a motherboard is, but you still retain key features like 4 RAM DIMM slots and of course support for the whole range of Ryzen 7000 processors. As far as the Intel options for that higher end of 1080p gaming, the i5-13400F is an awesome shout. That's going to work particularly well with something like this B760AX. This is one of the cheapest DDR5 motherboards. I would always advise you pick up a DDR5 board for the Intel side of the equation if you're building a system from scratch, as that newer DDR5 memory is going to last longer. DDR4 is very much in a sunset to the past. Goodbye DDR4. So DDR5 is a much better way to spend your money, especially now it's come down so much in price. The B760 chipset still gives you like RAM overclocking support and stuff, you just don't get any CPU overclocking. In terms of moving up the ladder and going on to that slightly higher end of 1080 to 1440p gaming, for AMD and Intel there are once again a couple of choices. My main recommendation would be a B650 motherboard once again, like this MSI B650M mortar, or this slightly more pretty and a bit more advanced ROG Strix B650A gaming Wi-Fi, alongside a Ryzen 5 7600X. I actually saw this chip discounted to just over $200 or £200, though prices are of course subject to change, something which is an incredible deal when you consider how powerful the CPU is. Compare that to something like the Intel Core i5-13600K, and you are seeing less value from Team Blue. The 13600K directly rivals the Ryzen 5 7600X. It is better for multi-threaded performance, meaning those of you looking to get into streaming or video editing should consider that chip instead, but it's going to cost you more money for the privilege. So if you're looking to game at 1440p, the Ryzen 5 7600X is the best value shout, but the 13600K from Intel should not be thrown out of your consideration process either. Of course, a major advantage of AMD over Intel is that on the B760 motherboards that are a little bit cheaper, like this GeekaWhat board or this MSI B760 Tomahawk, there is no CPU overclocking. AMD does allow you to do that on the B650 lineup, allowing for those slightly faster clock speeds. These mid-range combos for 1440p are going to be good for anything up to about an RTX 4070 or RX 6800 XT. Move any further higher end to something like a 4080 and you want to step the CPU up. Which brings me on to my next combos, the top-end 1440p and budget 4K gaming CPUs. Now at this price point, once again things are a little bit complicated. Until recently, the Intel Core i7-13700K took the biscuit. It provided better performance and better value than either of the 13th gen i5 or i9 chips, and with loads of great Z790 boards, including this ASUS Prime Z790A Wi-Fi. This, by the way, is one of my favorite motherboards ever. Take a look at this. Packed with plenty of features, PCI Gen 5 for your M.2 and your PCI slot, with this toolless little catch so you can easily unclip the GPU, DDR5 memory support, and then on the rear I/O, loads of connectivity, 20 gigabit USB-C, loads of Type A's, a 10 gigabit USB-C, Wi-Fi 6E, display connections, decent VRM cooling at a budget price point, really is quite impressive. But things have changed a little bit. Although the motherboards on the Z790 side provide a bit better value than the X670 boards in my opinion, AMD have gone ahead and done something just a little bit special, because that's what they always do, give them a bit of time. They launched this, the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. Now if you've heard the letters X3D before, you might think, oh, that sounds familiar. What on earth is that all about? Basically, it's AMD's 3D stacked cache. 3D stacked cache is when AMD adds loads more cache to the CPU and stacks it on top of each other. Cache is one of the biggest bottlenecks in modern CPUs, making the 3D chips that bit more special. And with AMD's recent price competitiveness, the 7800X3D goes down as the best CPU you can buy right now for gaming. In my mind, you don't want to pair this with a B650 motherboard. You're simply wasting the potential of a CPU like this. So let's discard both of our B650 motherboards, and you instead want to look at an X670E option, like that one. There are cheaper X670, but let me go and get another one. Whoopsie daisy. Rest in peace, the $500 motherboard. It was too expensive anyway. This is a better shout for something like the Ryzen 7 7800. There's literally motherboards everywhere. This, the MSI X670E Tomahawk Wi-Fi. Rant incoming. This is a great CPU, but AMD, your motherboard's so confusing. So we've established this is the higher end chipset, but you might notice this is an X670E board. They also do X670 boards without the E. And the letter's quite important. It stands for extreme, and basically basically all it means is that this motherboard has PCI Generation 5, the non-E variant doesn't. PCI Gen 5 is supported in the new super fast SSDs like this Crucial drive we took a look at a couple of weeks ago over on GeekaWhat.com, and is going to be the PCI standard we expect the next generation of graphics cards will use. Now, it isn't a total given that that will be the case, but when there's only $10 or $15 in it, I can wholly recommend you get an E-series motherboard when you're spending already, $350 on a CPU. That's going to give you that bit more future-proofing, as much as I hate that word, and make sure that you at least aren't causing yourself too many headaches for later on. The 7800X3D is basically good for anything like a 4080, 7900 XT or XTX. Even a 4090 would be fine on this, but bear in mind it is a little bit light on cores, especially compared to either an AMD Ryzen 9 or, even better, the i9-13900K, a chip that's got over 20 cores, over 30 threads, and is going to give you far more beef in the multi-threaded department. AMD is certainly on top right now for gaming, but if you are looking for a build that's also going to be amazing for streaming, video editing, I always would recommend going for the Intel chip. There isn't much in it, but the extra cores certainly help. Now that brings me on to my final comment, but before then, let me clear the desk off so we can have a little bit more clarity, because it's a complete mess right now. As I recommend to you guys the very best CPU and motherboard combo if you've got more money than sense, or you just want the ultimate gaming, video editing, rendering, 3D modeling experience. On the Intel side, the i9-13900K or the far more pricey 13900KS are great shouts. Awesome single thread performance, more cores than you can count with your fingers, or your fingers times 2, literally, it's mad. And on the AMD side, you want something like a Ryzen 9 with a board like this from MSI, the X670E Ace. This is about as high end as you want to go. Same with our Intel board options, the Aorus Master from GeekaWhat and the Maximus Z790 Hero from ASUS. You can see there, Maximus Z790 Hero. These are the boards that are going to give you those extra features. They're going to give you supreme overclocking. They're going to give you loads of connectivity in terms of your high bandwidth USB-Cs and USB-As. They're going to give you Wi-Fi 6E, 2.5 or even 10 gig Ethernet in most cases. They're going to give you multiple PCI Gen 5 slots, heaps of RGB and beautiful aesthetics with features everywhere. If you are going to go for a high-end CPU like a Ryzen 9 or an i9, definitely pick yourself up not only the higher end chipset motherboard, but one that's going to give you those features. To summarize, on the very budget, you want an i3 with a B660 or B760. Move up the range and you want a low-end i5 or Ryzen 5 7600 with a B-series motherboard for both. On the upper mid-range, you want the 13600K or preferably Ryzen 5 7600X, once again with a B-series motherboard. At the higher end, you want the, not this one, where's it gone? The Ryzen 7 7800 X3D, one of the most impressive chips I've ever seen, with an X670E motherboard or an i7 13700K with a Z790 design, while the top-end gamers will want a Ryzen 9 with an X670E board, preferably the 7950 X3D if you've got money to burn, or an i9 13900K with a Z790 Master, Hero, or Ace. If you enjoyed this video, check out all the links below to buy any of the stuff mentioned. Make sure to get subscribed. We'd love to have you back here on the channel for more videos in the future. Thank you for watching. I'm going to clear up some other boards, and I'll see you very soon. The poor Master board. It's like about $600.